9:57:86, Monday, March 30th. $20.26. This is Kabbalah and coffee and Kabbalah, coffee and Kabbalah. No one really knows for sure. Elevate, Elo, Divrei, Elokim, Chaim, but this is the majority led by. No one really knows for sure. Elevate, Elo, Divrei. No one really knows for sure. Elevate, Elo, Divrei, Elokim, Chaim, but this is the majority led by. 37:61, creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve, Chava. 36:31, 130 born. Hmm. 94 days of this bitch. Here's introduction to Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism.
I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development and to the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading this, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your participation. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. So, let's just review a bit about Shabtai Tzvi, and let's move past Shabtai. We spent enough time on this guy. As you can see, he's there on the left, and I think I mentioned a minute ago, this is a depiction from life. This is what it probably looks like. It's actually pretty difficult to underplay the disaster that was Shabbatianism. We're talking about a movement that basically began in 1666 and in until 1880s. We're talking about a movement, a sort of mobile disaster inside of Judaism that led people to believe that abandoning Judaism was part of their salvation. I can't really articulate how much of a disaster that is. When people believe that converting to a religion that hates them, that is actively seeking their conversion to destroy their identity, that's a disaster. It's really a disaster. Now, when an individual Jew decides to convert, when an individual Jew decides to leave Judaism for reasons of conscience, that's their business and that's their right. Every Jew should be allowed to convert to whatever religion that they find they see fit. But the truth of the matter is, these people weren't converting of a choice they were making on their own. They were converted because they were being led by people who delusionally believed in their messianic prowess and their messianic message. So, in that way, I do see this as a kind of disaster, train wreck that stretched over 2 centuries, basically. And Frankism was especially bad. We're talking about a situation where Jews had been systematically repressed for centuries in Poland, and then they were brought by the thousands into Catholicism. And as you can imagine, the moment they converted into Catholicism, when they converted into Islam, converting back was not an easy thing. We should not forget that converting back out of Islam is a death penalty. That's apostasy. That's a death penalty case. And of course, no one has to remind anyone about the horrors of converting to Catholicism and then trying to convert back. It's not going to happen. This is a one-way street, and Frankism and Shabbatianism were a disaster in many ways for thousands of Jews over the course of a couple of centuries. And I think these should be forced conversions of a certain kind, because they were predicated on the idea of some apocalyptic potential. Things are ultimately going to come to an end really fast. And that never materialized. The end just got delayed and delayed and delayed. And secondly, the reasons why these conversions from Judaism to Catholicism and Islam, the mystical jibber-jabber underwrote them constantly changed. It was never systematic. There was never any spelled-out theory about why this is supposed to happen and how it's supposed to work. You have a bunch of charismatic men at the center of this movement who benefit greatly from these conversions. Frank benefited greatly. Shabbatai, in his own way, also benefited. And this is a situation where that's people are led into conversions that I think forced by the charismatic leaders of the movement. In the same way that I don't think that people at Jonestown killed themselves. I think they were murdered. I refuse to carry the Jonestown as mass suicide. That was mass murder precipitated by Jim Jones. And so I think that in many ways these conversions were forced. They were forced by the charisma of some of these leaders. And to be clear, an argument can be made, and I would make the argument, that this is what happens when mysticism goes off the rails. This is what happens when rationalism is abandoned. This is what happens when you allow emotion and you allow fervor, mystical beliefs that you don't really understand to basically run ramshot. And at the end of the day, I'm very sympathetic to mysticism. I'm very sympathetic in many ways to Kabbalah. But this is the gutter of Kabbalah. It is mass conversions, and it is the disaster of the Shabbati movement. Now, what's about that is that it's a disaster. Given the extraordinary point of the mass conversions following the wake of Shaddai and Frankism, Kabbalah kind of got off a light touch. Kabbalah survived. You would think that after all, seeing the dangers of what Kabbalah could do, what check, just advancement into this whole Kabbalistic thing, this entire thing has led us into the gutter of mass conversion. We need to abandon this idea. This idea is toxic, it's dangerous. Well, they did realize it was dangerous. That's to be sure. We'll talk about that more tonight. They did realize it was dangerous, and they made safeguards. They put rails on the system to ensure that it did not go off the rails like this again. And yet, Kabbalah survived. It really got off with a pretty light touch, actually. And I think that part of the reason why is because the Shabbatian movement, you can imagine, I always imagine the Shabbatian movement as coming in like a wave, a huge Shabbatian wave that comes in like the tide, and then when the tide comes out, all this beautiful soil is left behind, but the water's gone. Shabbatai is the water coming in, bringing in the beautiful silt that will help to grow the new things, and then Shabbatai leaves. And what's left behind is the black earth that will ultimately grow new things. So in many ways, scholarship in a previous generation argued that Kabbalah made Shabbatai possible. I don't think that's true. I think that actually Shabbatai made Kabbalah possible. And I think that relationship is why Kabbalah is going to survive. Because the Kabbalah is so much more sophisticated, it's so much more deep, it's so much more rich than Shabbatai's faith and Frankists, who only ever really, aside from Nathan of Gaza, who only really ever developed the most thin, superficial, self-serving, apocalyptic version of Kabbalah that was engineered basically to deify them. And at the end of the day, the Kabbalah that they wrote was a pretty crap Kabbalah, who I think was a very profound Kabbalist. I will give that to Nathan of Gaza. But Shabbatai himself, Frank, they were never deep Kabbalists, and they were never really actually, I think, about the Kabbalistic life. I think at the end of the day, they were about themselves, and their actions proved it. And when they left, the Kabbalah could stand on its own. It didn't need them. It existed before them. It was deeper and richer than they could have possibly imagined. And thank God, in many ways, it survived them, and it thrived. So tonight we talk about Kabbalah in the aftermath of Shabbatai. What I want to really try to talk about this is, I don't want to talk about this as post-Shabbatian Kabbalah, because Shabbatai Tzvi, Frankist movement, and all that stuff that we've been talking about, that's an aberration. It was sort of like a night where everyone had, it was like a bender. You know, everyone on a bender, they went to New Orleans, they did all the things, and they went back to their homes, and they shook off the bender. And so you can think about Shabbatian movement as a kind of a big bender. They went down there, got trashed, did coke, and they did all the things. And then when they came back home, they straightened it up, and so I think of the Shabbat as a kind of bender in the history of Judaism. So what happens in the immediate aftermath of 1666 when Shabbatai converts? Well, obviously the first thing that we've already talked about, there are people who are diehard believers who do everything they can to convince themselves, using every tool they have in Kabbalah and Torah, to convince themselves that Shabbatai is the Messiah, no matter what. No matter if he apostatizes, no matter if he dies, no matter if the movement splits into three groups, no matter if they all convert to Catholicism, there's all willing to do the work to convince everyone that this is true. And there are diehard every religion, there are diehards in almost every belief system. No matter what happens, they convince themselves of what they believe. Now, again, we spend a lot of time talking about them. They're out there. They're going to be out there into the 1880s. Also, in the immediate aftermath of 1660, there were a ton of people who realized that this was a catastrophe. They were people who believed in Shabbatai. In 1666, when it apostatized, they realized, oh man, this is really bad. And what's also critically important about this is that the people who, at the very beginning of this, realized this was a disaster, people like Menachem in Israel, those people who knew from the very beginning this was going to be a crazy thing, never did the told you so moment, so far as I know. From what I know in history of Judaism, there's never a major I told you so moment where people gloat and people say, I told you so, and you go jump in a river, you believed in this guy, and now you're barking back at the tree, you're barking back at my tree trying to get back to synagogue, and you were happy to pray to this idiot. Now he's abandoned you, and now what? We can go somewhere else, go be Christian. What's incredible is the Jews and the rabbis who have seen people make this mistake welcome them back. And to my knowledge, I don't see that they told them so moment. They just didn't do that. They were very magnanimous. And they began to do the work. And what was the work? The work was, let's just pretend this never happened. Right? Let's just pretend this never happened. So what did they do? The second camp, people that realized disaster, they went back to doing what they were doing before genocide. They went back to intellectual labor, trying to monetize it. Trying to figure out how the organic Kabbalah lines up with the photographic Kabbalah. They went back to the heavy lifting of trying to do Kabbalah in a pretty systematic manner. That's not to say that they just ignored it completely. They realized that something inside of organic Kabbalah, something inside of the Kabbalistic impulse was dangerous. Because it had gone off the rails. And so they began slowly to think about how to implement safeguards to prevent this from happening. This could have led to real serious problems. Can you imagine what would happen if all the Jews got on those boats and began to sail into the Mediterranean to reach Palestine? It could have been terrifying. Tens of thousands of Jews would have died. They could have been denied entry into the Ottoman Empire. And who knows what would happen? They can sail back to Spain. They're going to arrive as refugees in Christian Europe. This could have been even much, much, much worse than it was. And in fact, it's actually very lucky that it was only as bad as it was. So the rabbis began very carefully dealing with the problem of beginning the business of putting bumpers, basically, on the Kabbalah to prevent it from going off the rails again. And what do those bumpers look like? The main thing is, public Kabbalistic teaching, especially advanced Kabbalah, just stops. It just stops. You just cannot teach people if they don't understand it. You just can't. Not teach people how to weld if they've never held a hammer before. You have to. You cannot for these incredibly complex Kabbalistic ideas, which are incredibly easy to misinterpret. People basically just don't even have a origin. Especially people who have been living in Christian lands who have only recently converted back to Judaism. So they cease teaching Kabbalah publicly. They cease teaching it publicly. Now I know that makes many of us grit. That makes many of us think, oh, these elitists, how dare they hide this? Well, you got to put yourself in their shoes. These people were playing, it's like toddlers playing with fire. These people were not prepared to deal with this, and they were convinced themselves basically insane because they had early kids who were able to basically do this. So what ends up happening is that the first thing is that Kabbalah, public Kabbalah teaching begins to withdraw, especially technical stuff. Then a creeping kind of legalism begins to creep in, and that legalism takes the form of safeguards. You need to vet. You can learn this stuff. And how do you vet? You vet them based on all kinds of other factors of stability. What are those things look like? But they're old enough. You don't teach a 13-year-old Kabbalah. You should wait. How old? Maybe 40. And that was the number they set along. I bet folks have heard that number. Well, do you want to teach Kabbalah to a bachelor? No. Because a bachelor might get so crazily Kabbalistic they're just married to God, and they don't want to actually get married to a woman or whatever, right? From a traditional perspective. So they need to be married. They need to have a job. They need to have kids. Anchoring them to this world. I've actually heard somewhere that Air Force pilots have to be married with kids or something like that because they don't want them getting in like $50 million, $30 million plane flying around. The idea is you need to be anchored in this world. You can go to the other world. You can go to the Kabbalistic and self fine. But you need something in this world. You need kids and a family. You cannot just be Kabbalah. That's unhealthy. So they begin to try to implement things at the community level that ensure that people who are mentally ill, people who aren't drunks, people who are other kinds of things are anchored in the world. Now again, does that sound elitist? Maybe it does sound elitist. But is it reasonable? I think it's reasonable. Is it reasonable? And just what happened with Shabbat Tzvi is very reasonable. I think it's very eminently reasonable. So again, I think it's not a bizarre idea. Third, there is a shift away from Kabbalah, away from cosmological speculation. That cosmological side became implanted in the world, as we talked about last time with the Drush tonight, the dragons, just ground the whole. That's over. We're just going to be messianic speculation. By the way, that's a return that's very clear. The Talmud says do not speculate about the beginning, do not speculate about the end. Speculate about now. Right? Speculate about now. Don't deal with Masa Bereshit. Do not deal with the end of the world. Deal with now. That's a return to very important students. And we're going to see that when we get to Hasidism in a minute, Hasidism is the epitome of mystification, the mysticism of the now. Hasidism says the now. What? Like right in your face, literal thing, the world we're living in right now is more mystically important than what happened back then and what's going to happen later. And so Hasidism is going to pioneer the mysticism of the now. So they really take this into great heights and represent part of an enormous genius of Hasidism. So there's a shift. And what does this shift look like? There's a shift away from what's going on here. Right? Because trying to figure if that was dangerous. So what's the shift? The shift is into here. The shift is into here. Right? The shift is into the mind and into the heart. It's about personal piety. And so it's all about fixing you. We are not focusing our attention on trying to become Messiah anymore. That was a disaster. We're done with that. What we do now, we now focus our attention on inner piety. And so the shift in the Kabbalist language is now toward inner teaching. Not messianic saving the world stuff. It's about saving you and your community. And that's an intense piety coming in this form of these things we'll talk about in a minute. This idea of kavanot, intense spiritual concentration, and following Jewish law very seriously. Remember, part of what people were very upset about with Shabbat Tzvi in the Shabbati movement was the rejection of Jewish law. And so what ends up happening is that Jewish law goes on. And the early bar is, the Zohar never said you need to abandon the law. In fact, the Zohar is very clear that the law, that Kabbalah without the Jewish law, without Kabbalah, is incoherent. In the post-Shabbati movement, is the return to Kabbalah and truth. It's exactly divorcing Kabbalah from that was a disaster in the mind of these Kabbalists. I didn't agree. And so this is a return back to the old school things of Kabbalah. So at the end of the day, Kabbalah will live. Thank God. It deserves to. It should not have been thrown out with the baby with that water. I'm glad, very glad for that. But we have to admit that I think the kind of safeguards out of life aftermath of all this are not unreasonable. What's also important about this is this story sometimes gets told from a super Eurocentric perspective. Surprise, Eurocentrism, here it is. The truth of the matter also is that Kabbalistic centers are also gearing all over control. In many places in which Shaktism really never took a big hold. And those places are going to be places like Morocco, places like Yemen, although Shabbatism was very popular in Yemen and Morocco, Kurdistan, northern Iraq, Aleppo, and Baghdad, also in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, you remember, was a holdout. Jerusalem condemned Shabbatism from the very beginning. So these centers in the Arab world, out of the European world, are going to be the first to come back online, and they're going to begin producing an enormous Kabbalistic literature. Now, the sad truth of that has been lost, especially as Jews fled Arab lands, were expelled from Arab lands in the 1950s. A lot of that literature has been lost, and most of it, to my knowledge, remains manuscript. When I say manuscript, I mean handwritten books from the 16th century, 17th century. So there's not even printed editions of these books. But we know, and I know this because of other scholars who surveyed the literature, there is a mountain of Kabbalistic literature out there, heavily working on systematizing Floridian Kabbalah at this time. One of the real interesting personalities that appears in all this is Barzani. Atha Barzani is probably the first woman rabbi that we know of, like someone who actually may have really held that title. And she was a Kabbalist, and she seems to have had supernatural powers. She lived in Kurdistan, in what is now northern Iraq. And her father was very charismatic, and he died, and there was no one basically to take his place. He was just such a macher. And the only person that qualified was his daughter. And so by default, his daughter took his place, and Atha becomes basically, I think, the world's first rabbi, and she's an active Kabbalist. And there's a great children's book about her too, by the way. I don't know if it's seen the children's not recently. There's a book of her. I don't know, look at it, but it's really neat. She's just a really incredible character. She's just a really incredible character. Powerful woman living in Kurdistan. I think it's worth mentioning that we have women in science, so let's make sure his name Atha Barzani. There are two major centers that emerge in this period in the world of Kabbalah. One in Jerusalem, and one in what is now Poland. What is now Poland? It's already telling the world is dividing, and Poland's going to be a center of Jewish life, of course, and Jerusalem will be as well. The first one is Beit El, the House of God, which was founded by Yemenite Kabbalists. Right? We haven't talked much about Yemenite Kabbalah. There were tons of Yemenite Kabbalists. Beit El was founded by probably one of the most erudite Kabbalists of his day. I would say he's probably the most erudite Kabbalist of his day, Shalom Rabbi. And Rabbi's physical school, the actual school that he taught in, survived all the way to the 1920s. He was only destroyed in an earthquake in Jerusalem. You could have gone there in the 1920s. The physical school was still there. And Kabbalists in his school had one of the longest Kabbalistic universities, basically, in the world. So, again, so much of the way we're taught Kabbalah is so Eurocentric. But the truth of the matter is, this is a Mizrahi Jew, Yemenite Jew, running one of the longest functioning Kabbalistic schools in Jerusalem. So he died in 1777, and his Kabbalah becomes very important. Now, the main thing that they do in the school of Beit El is that it's social and it's theoretical. The first thing they do is they turn their attention exclusively to Lurianic Kabbalah. They are probably the principal systematizers of Lurianic Kabbalah in this period. The main systematizers of this. And what they systematize it around of Kavanot. And these Kavanot, I know we use the word Kavanot now as kind of but in another Kabbalistic sense, think of them as foci of spiritual concentration. Imagine one's soul as a kind of light, and that in order to gain the infinite access to the infinite light of the Godhead, you have to focus it, just like a radio wave, or any other kind of thing. If you have unfocused energy, it doesn't do anything. It's only by focusing that energy, focusing that spiritual energy, that you kind of get on the wavelength of God. It sounds super New Agey, but there's a reason why they use New Agey people use the metaphors they do. They're not bad metaphors. And the idea is that you have this wild energy, this wild spiritual energy, and you have to focus it, and you focus it in prayer. Prayer is the lens that focuses this energy, And the way that you focus it, the lens of prayer is using these kavanot. And Rabbi's Siddur has been published. It is Siddur. It's obviously on Hebrew. And his Siddur includes hundreds of these kavanot. And these kavanot are sort of like micro adjustments of your soul to focus your soul during prayer on various aspects of correcting and repairing and shaping your inner life. How exactly you want to connect to God or connect to the various aspects of the Sphirot, how you want to comport your soul as it reaches up into the spiritual world. And so it's through these very complicated kavanot, which were actually written down and memorized, and they were exams, these are kavanot exams. You had to know how to match the exams up, apparently. This was a very rigorous school of Kabbalah, but notice here again, it's about the interior life of the Kabbalist. It's not about some other stuff. It's about learning to focus your spiritual being upon God in a radically sharp, defined, and focused way. What's interesting about the school is that two things are interesting about it. One is that it was incredibly student teacher oriented, which is to say they did not teach this stuff publicly. You could not go listen to a lecture at Beidel publicly. You had to be vetted in, you had to be tested, you had to be declared, you had to have incredible levels of education to even knock on the door. So this was a school that heavily prioritized a high level of rigorous Jewish life. Singing songs in Ladino and you had to rigorously apply yourself to Judaism. You had to take exams. This is Kabbalah at its most spiritual aspect. Further, you could sign basically an NDA. You could never teach this stuff publicly. And secondly, you had to sign a letter of agreement that you pledged yourself to the school of Beidel, and that you would pledge yourself for your entire life. And you had to pledge yourself, even in the world to come, that you would only study with other members of Beidel in the world to come too. In the base midrash, in Olam Haba, in the house of study in the world to come, Beidel would be there. You had to go study there. And so even the idea here is that you had to dedicate yourself to eternity to the school. And so again, a high level of rigor. And there were people still matriculating through Beidel all the way through the early 20th century. And I guess the last inheritor of the school of the Kavanot of Shalom Mizrahi Shirabi, he died in 1969. So it just lasted for centuries. The other major school of Poland, right, and Brody, what is now Poland, and this was known as the Klois, right, Klois. So the Klois was much more like a spiritual fraternity. It wasn't an actual school in the sense of Beidel, where you went to a place and learned. It was much more like a spiritual fraternity with various kinds of, and more people sort of meet sort of a general organization of spirituality. I don't know exactly compared to Freemasons, but it was something like a spirit Kabbalistic fraternity. And it also focused heavily on Berean Kabbalah. Notice they're all hunkering down on Berean Kabbalah. That becomes the basic standard of Kabbalah for a minute. But the main thing you'll notice about this is it's primarily attracting Lithuanians. So those Lithuanian folks, as we'll see in a minute, are a bit more elitist, and they're much more intellectualist, right? So there's a high level of intellectualist elitism going on in the Lurianic world, or in the Lithuanian world. And with some exceptions, there are definitely there too, but generally speaking, a much more heavy intellectualist form is much more prayer-oriented. The Polish school is much more intellectually oriented. They're much more interested in systematizing Kabbalah and really hammering out exactly a kind of systematic theology of Judaism, basically Lurianic Kabbalah. Now, they do publish a lot of their works. We actually have a ton of works published by members of the Klois. So they did publish books. These books are very technical. I tried to look at some today in early Hebrew books, and I couldn't make hardly heads and tails of this stuff. And you have to. The level of Kabbalistic education, the level of Talmudic education, the level of these guys is stupid. These are genius kind of stuff. That's what I'm trying to read today. It's like quantum mechanics. I mean, it's so high level. Their books do survive in early modern books. You can actually view them online if you want to. If you want to check them out. Like I said, I really struggle to make even 10, 15 sentences make sense to me. Kind of barely can follow it. It's like, I don't know, it's like trying to read Deleuze or some kind of crazy post-structuralist people reading that. Although it's that challenging. Their works are also published, but there are no translations. There are no modern editions. I don't know if they've even reprinted since then. And you're a common thing now, right? They only exist at this time. They've never been reprinted. They've never been translated. The reason for that, actually, just very clearly, I'll go ahead and spoiler tell you, is the Holocaust. The Holocaust is the complete cultural interruption of Kabbalah. It amputates an entire people, not just from their families, but it amputates the people from their entire world. And basically, the stuff just gets advanced. I mean, that's what happens when you flee for your life. You just can't say this stuff on the march to these terrible camps. So much of this literature is basically an orphan, and it's going to take 3 generations of scholars to basically bring it back into it. It's going to take that, at least that much. It is a monumental task. And this time period, by the way, I think is probably some of the most sophisticated Kabbalist literature ever written. And it languishes in complete obscurity because there are just so few people with the skills to bring them in. Hebrew skill, Kabbalah skills, Bible skills. It doesn't exist. It just the level of Kabbalist scholarship of this time, 1750s, 1800s, even in the 19th century, the level of Kabbalist scholarship is so high in Central Europe that it's never recovered. Never, ever recovered. And it's going to take 100 years, 200 years probably, to recover, to get Kabbalist scholarship back up to where it was. Is typically a bit more rationalistic. And when I say rationalistic, what I mean is they're intellectualists. For them, they're trying to use Kabbalah to a system of basically Jewish theology. They're trying to formulate a Jewish theology that makes sense. And for folks who know a little bit about the Litvish world, you can probably tell I have a great deal of sympathy for the Litvish world. I much more heavily identify with the yeshivish Litvish world than the Hasidic world. Although I still have a great admiration for the Hasidic world as well. But as you may know, folks who study the Talmud, the famous Brisker method emerges out of the Litvish world. The Brisker method is known to be, they compare it to balancing equations. It's like doing, it's like you ever balance chemicals stuff in chemistry. It's like taking things apart on a molecular level. And so the Brisker method is famous for its billboard. It's nitpicking, making time disagreements, analyzing things in tiny detail as opposed to how do we apply all this? They don't care. They're like, no, we must very strictly understand every single logical relationship. And so this is the world that produced some of the greatest logic textbooks and Jewish logic, some of the greatest logic textbooks in Halakha. The Litvish world is famous and infamous for this. And what this gives rise to is a heavily intellectualist culture and a heavily elitist culture. And as you might imagine, and again, when I say elitist, I mean that in both the good sense and the bad sense of that word. I mean that in the good sense that these are elite scholars. And again, when I say elite, I don't mean elite in just a bad way. These are some of the smartest Jews in the world working under these. They are this is the Nobel Prize of Judaism working in Kabbalah and stuff. Now that also clear, they do see that these Amchite Jews, these poor Jews, these Polish Jews working in the fields in shtetl, who barely can read and scratch together an education to read a Siddur, they do think of themselves as somehow better. Not somehow, they're better. I mean, in the same way that I think a Nobel Prize winner is going to think a high school C student in physics. They're just not going to compare. And there is an intellectualist, and I mean this now in the negative sense, an intellectualist milieu that develops in this Litvish world, where they really do believe that, poor, illiterate, bumpkin Jews, they can do their very best, and maybe they want to offend God. But can they really serve God? Can they understand God? Can they really do the heavy lifting of being a rigorous Jew? No. Not really. never going to be really pious. They're going to have a middling piety at best, sort of a pumpkin piety. And so this intellectualist elitist trend is going to take hold in Central Europe, especially among the Litvak schools. And again, that's not for me. I have a lot of sympathy for the Litvak schools, but that trend does take hold. And it's into that trend Hasidism will emerge in that world. So Hasidism kind of movement in lots of ways, obviously. The main thing that's interesting about it is it is neither Shabbatian, although it bears a lot of similarity to Shabbatianism. We'll talk about in a minute. So it seems to have preserved many of the attractive things that made Shabbatianism popular. So it seems to have kind of produced a Shabbatianism without Shabbatai. It has the kind of enthusiasm side. So it has all the infusion, all of the emotion, all of the messianic dictation, but it does not center Shabbatai speak. It's not Shabbatai. Probably. The other thing is it doesn't go as intellectualistic either. It doesn't go in the direction of the Klois, and it doesn't go in the direction of the Litvish world. It's a unique way of sailing in between a real difference in the Jewish world. Whereas the Litvish world was very intellectual, very elitist, it doesn't go that direction. And it doesn't go in the absolute antinomian direction of diffusion and joy and do whatever you want. It sails in between. And unsurprisingly, it's going to be world changing in the Jewish world. In many ways, Hasidism is, for most people, more than just Orthodox Judaism. It will be that successful. Hasidism will be that successful. So it's begun, of course, by the mystic and practical Kabbalist. When I say practical Kabbalist, you should read something like Magician. It was basically a Jewish magician. This was a thing that was practiced back in this time. It was a kind of practical where you would make amulets and you would do mystical herbal treatments and you would do all kinds of what we would now recognize as basically Jewish magic. There were a bunch of these guys that referred to themselves as Baal Shems, good names. And Israel ben Eliezer was known, of course, as the Baal Shem Tov. And he, and I should not say 18th, 16th century, or 16th. He was a mystical healer. He did a lot of relatively parochial jobs. He was sort of a beadle in synagogue to taught kids. He was never much of a person outside of the movement until he really came into his own as a kind of extraordinarily innovative and charismatic preacher of a new kind of Judaism. And this new kind of Judaism was heavily mystically involved. It involved teaching mysticism to the public, although in a very modified way. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And it was a very effusive form of Judaism. It was a Judaism that was accessible to anyone. It was not a Judaism that was a Judaism of elite scholars. It was a Judaism that could be accessible to anyone walking along the road on a day's journey to the month. So the ideas of the Baal Shem Tov bring to bear all of the enthusiasm of the Shabbatian movement, but it's incredibly important, but a halakhic rigor that anchors it in the traditional world of Jewish life. So it does the work, right? The Baal Shem Tov he squared the circle, folks. He squared to bring the energy of the Shabbatian movement, but he could also anchor it and locate it in the world of halakhic Judaism. And there's a slogan, I think, for the Hasidic movement. It's actually can be found in Tikkun Zohar 122 base. And this is probably the most famous, I think, basic slogan of Hasidism, right? Late atar paduim. So this literally means in Aramaic, there is no place devoid of God. There's no place devoid of Him, whatever. There's no place devoid of God. Everywhere is God. Everywhere is God. They say if you take the gematria of Elohim, right, and the gematria of Teva, nature, They add up to the same thing. Elohim and Teva are the same thing. God is nature. Sounds like Spinoza, a little bit like Spinoza, right? They say, look, there is no place. God cannot be anywhere other than where God is, and there can be no place devoid of God. Therefore, everywhere is where God is. Now, not everything is God. They're panentheists, not pantheists. And they say that, yes, there are things that are not God. All kinds of things. Everything around you is not God, but hiding underneath them all is God. There is no place where God is not. And so the thing that one must do, one must learn to focus on the immanence of God, uncover the reality of God all around yourself and you. And this task is to show that God is in all being, God is in all things, and God is in all acts. That even the task of changing the tire, the wheel on a part in the life, is an act of piety if you see God in it, if you find God in it. And so the idea here is that God is everywhere. And piety, the task of piety, is to the divinity all around you. But God, you never see God's face, you see God's back. So God's back is what you see all around us. You do seek God's fit. Face in the most tiny things that you do. That is, of course, I think at the core of the Hasidic impulse. So it's profoundly beautiful and poetic impulse. So the task is not just to follow Jewish law, but you must, because Jewish law is the primary gateway to God. But it's to realize that everything allows you to approach God. Everything that you do, everything that you are, allows you to cling to God. The Vekus, core idea and Hasidism, that by clinging to God, by uncovering God in everything you do, the moment you take a sip of wine, the sweetness of wine is a taste of God. That the light of the Shabbat candles, the light in the Shabbat candles is an entrance into seeing the light of God. And so that you cover your eyes before you see them for the first time in Shabbat, so that when you uncover your eyes, you see them, you may see them without the cover, the back of God, peer directly into the light. Right? That is just the light candles in the to God. Everywhere is God hiding, and the process is there to find God. It's where you find God found in you, because you're made in the image of God. You're made the Tselem Elohim. You're made in the image of God. You're a mirror of God. Everything that is you is in some sense an aspect of God. But the mirror is dirty. You have to clean the mirror. How do you clean the mirror? You undergo a process called, you can clean the mirror of all creation, right? The emptying out of what is. And as you empty out, as you negate what is, what's left behind from the negation of what is there's just God left. And so you purify your mind. You don't think bad thoughts. And if you do think bad thoughts, you convert the bad thoughts into good thoughts. If you see a beautiful woman walking around the road and you lust after her intensely, feel the lust. Let the lust wash over you. Feel the passion in your body. And know that the lust that you feel for the woman walking down is just a pale glimpse of how much you crave to love God. Convert the feeling of the lust, of the sin, of the Aveira, convert it into the passion that you would have for God. So it's not about blotting out things. It's not about not feeling things. It's not about going under ascetic practices and rolling around the snow. So you feel things, feel it. The sin is real. And convert the sin, redeem the sin, give to the Aveira a tikkun, give to the sin a reparation. Yourself, you'll cleanse your ego, you'll elevate yourself through victorious. So all of these things allow you to approach God in your everyday life. Everyday life, everything around you hides God and is God. And you can approach those things in their physicality. So much of Kabbalah became so intellectual in the Litvish world, became so about figuring out how the sphere do this, and where is things so, and how do things so empty itself out, Shimu, and what are the shards left behind, and how the shards fall to this part. It's this very complicated intellectual thing. Hasidism said, what really matters for most people is that they must encounter the physical world, the world around them, the luck around them, the food they eat, the bed they sleep in, the clothes they wear. They must encounter all those things. The movement of their very body. That's where they need to find God. Not as some intellectuals trying to figure out Sphira stuff. Now, they don't abandon that. But for them, what matters is worship through body. Avoida Gavagash. Right? Worship, Avodah Bagash. Worshipping in one's physicality. That physicality is a gateway to divinity. That the body and sex, the body and eating, the body and feeling your body, even injury, can be avoida b'gashmi, can be a way to approach Hashem, access God. So this is a radical democratization of mysticism, where everything becomes an avenue to mysticism, every gateway to divinity. Now, this all gets focused in on the leaders of the movement. The leaders of the movement become these incredibly charismatic, and they were fabulously charismatic people with supernatural powers. You often hear stories of people who can look, they can see things happening for hundreds of miles away, and all kinds of stuff. There's all kinds of things in the Hasidic world. You know these stories about these leaders. These leaders establish dynasties. When I say courts and dynasties, these rebbes, these tzaddikim, right? These rebbes, they live like kings, and they have the ability to intercede on behalf of God. They're so righteous that their soul brushes up against God, and if they pray for you, then God heals you. Even if they're dead, even if the rebbe is dead, you leave letters in his grave, on his grave. His spirit, his soul can still reach up to Hashem and communicate your desire, your prayers, even beyond death. And that custom is still practiced today in the Hasidic world. These Sadokim, these Rebbes, are almost divine. They're saints, basically. And you imitate everything the Rebbe does. If the Rebbe drinks a little bit of schnapps before this, you should drink a little bit of schnapps. Because he's discovered some secret way of accessing mysticism. If he dances like this, you should dance like this. Everything the Rebbe does has some inner deep meaning, and the Rebbe is in many ways the gateway to God. So the Rebbes, the leaders of these Hasidic dynasties, become quasi-divine figures in ways. And these courts established all through Eastern Europe are fabulous. You're talking to dudes wearing thousands of gold coins. You're talking guys wearing silver garments that are like knit through with gold and silver thread. Because again, your very clothing is a gateway to God, and the more beautiful you are, the more you glorify yourself. Of course, at some level, it helps you to be more connected to God, because God's a king. Then maybe you should be a bit like a king too. And so the outfits they wear, and just the outfits they wear, cost tens of thousands of dollars for a coat. Tens of thousands, $40,000, $50,000 happy. Because it's all about the glory, the code of the red. So they establish these courts, and these courts go on to become the central pillars of the Hasidic movement, even to this day. So you probably know some of these courts. The Satmar court, which is now split between two brothers. The former Rebbe of the Satmar died. The Satmar movement is the biggest. Did you saw Unorthodox? Folks saw Unorthodox, the television show that depicts the Satmar dynasty. The Lubavitch movement. Chabad is a philosophy of Chabad, which is the actual dynasty. The Lubavitch movement is primarily known for its kiruv, which is to say outreach. They are a very outward-looking Hasidic movement that wants to bring people into Judaism, and they want to bring people into Judaism because that's part of how they do that's how they're going to redeem the world. Of course, they're also known for their at least some section of them in their belief that their late Rebbe, Menachem of blessed memory, is the Messiah, which I think is great. He's buried out in Queens a couple times, and it's a very powerful spiritual experience to pray there at the grave of the Rebbe. There's also a Rebbe's grave here in Detroit. If you ever get the chance to visit one, there's a Rebbe's grave here. Bells was in him? I can't remember exactly, but he died here. He just happened to be visiting here and died and buried him. And now it's going to visit the grave of the Rebbe. It's a big deal in the Hasidic world. Nachman of Breslov, if you go to the tomb certain times of the year, they ship in tens of thousands to see them all over the world. They invade this Ukrainian town so it's a big deal there. Now, what's important to know about these Hasidic Rebbes is that they weren't just enthusiastic, charismatic leaders who relied on emotions and enthusiasm to rope people in. These are systematic thinkers. Many of them were carefully systematic thinkers, and they produced some of the most innovative texts of Kabbalah of that time. No. Are they as rigorous as what's coming out of the Litvak school? No. Are they as intensely focused as what's coming out of Beit El or Jerusalem? No. But they are systematic treatises on Kabbalah from the point of view of Hasidism, which seeks to make Kabbalah something that you live. It's a thing that you live. It's a thing that you experience. It's a thing that you embody. And so it's not, in many ways, the kind of highly intellectualist Kabbalah that existed in the Lithuanian world. It's a much more livable kind of Kabbalah. Of course, the most famous book of this form of Kabbalah is the Tanya, which is something like scripture, basically, for the Lubavitch movement. You can get a copy of the Tanya anywhere. You can go anywhere there's a Lubavitch place and ask them for a copy of the Tanya. They will happily give you a copy of the Tanya. It's a little bit controversial because it claims that basically non-Jews don't have souls. They do a lot of acrobatics to try to explain that away, but it has some pretty famous parts. But the Tanya is probably the most famous. There are tons of Kabbalistic texts in the Hasidic world, and never let anyone tell you that they lack intellectual or spiritual rigor. It's simply a lie perpetuated by people that I typically actually sympathize with, but it's simply not true. These books are incredibly deep and incredibly powerful. Now, as you might imagine, this faced enormous kickback from the non-Jewish world. They had just dealt with the Shabbat fiasco. You got people doing damn headstands during prayer as part of their Avodah Hashem. They're like, you people are out of control. You're just Shabbatians. Crypto Shabbatians. You're bringing all this stuff in the list of tradition. You need to stop. And they were led by the Gaon of Vilna. And the Gaon of Vilna was a vociferous opponent of the Hasidic movement. The Lithuanian schools typically being referred to as misnagdim, opponents, right? And typically, sometimes I'm kind of misnogged in my personality, misnogged in my Judaism, which is funny because I have lots of Hasidic friends. The joke is, I'm more misnogged than more Hasidic, obviously. But this was a brutal that raged for a couple of generations. And I will say that, in all honesty, the Misnagdim are completely wrong here, folks. The early generations of the Hasidic movement, the first couple of generations of the Hasidic movement were pretty out of control. were pretty out of control. Especially, again, you have to think about this in the aftermath of the Shabbatite beatdown. They are terrified that it's going to go off the rails again. They're going to get one of these recipes to off and say the Messiah, and we're going to have to deal with the exact same disaster again. And I've gone through some of these already in a previous talk, but you can begin to see the Mishnah perspective. The tzaddik looks kind of like a little Messiah, right? The Rebbe looks a bit like a little Messiah. There's sort of a transgression for the sake of heaven angle here. There's kind of like they have to experience the sin of lust, and you have to convert it to God. You should feel lust, and then you convert it to feel lust for God. Feel lust. Why would you cultivate the thing of lust? You cannot do that. You cannot convert. You need to minimize that. Not feel it and then convert it. So they worried this was a kind of the cultivation of sin. Both of these movements emerge in Podolia. There's no denying that. Both the Hasidic movement and the Shabbat movement here emerge in the exact tiny region of Poland. And many people thought you grew up from the same earth, it's the same thing. Also, they are popularizing Kabbalah. Remember, right? Books like the Tanya by blessed memory, they are trying to bring Kabbalah back to the masses. That's one of the things that the Kabbalists at this time are trying to stop. They're like, no, these people were led astray by these ideas. Not because the ideas are bad, and maybe not because the people are inherently not capable of understanding them. They just can't understand them with their level of education. You cannot communicate these ideas to these people because it will go off the rails again. Hasidism says no. You bring them along, you educate them. You give them a little bit at a time until you raise them up so they can become understanding of these things. So there's a much higher degree of willingness on the part of the Hasidic world to incorporate Kabbalistic ideas into their connection to the mass and for the establishment, especially. They worry about Avodah Gashmu. They worry that this is also antinomianism. It's people doing weird stuff, doing handstands, cartwheels during prayer, people screaming during prayer. One of the Hasidics is Karliners. Karliners are the most metal of all of the Hasidic people. They're most metal because they're famous for screaming all of their prayers aloud. So if you ever go to a Karliner shul, which I've been, they just scream their prayers during the prayer cycle. You can imagine for a bunch of heady, intellectual, university-trained Jewish Kabbalists, a bunch of dudes screaming all the crying uncontrollable. That's crazy. This is Shabbatism again, right? So Avodah Gashmu early on was very, very worrying for this. The court setting with these rebbes and King, Shabbatai Tzvi did that. He was in Migdal Oz. He did that when he was in exile, Montenegro. He's now Montenegro. They're just being little Shabbatais. These rebbes are just being little Shabbatais. They're just little messiahs. And many of them thought they might be the Messiah. And that's an idea we get to when we get to the 20th century with the rise of Messianism and the Chabad Lubavitch. They were terrified one of these guys would pop off and turn themselves to the side. Further, some Shabbatim books were popular among early Hasidim. Hemba Yamin was a big one, right? But there were Shabbatim books that were popular among early Hasidim. So, the way the Mitnagim saw the Hasidic movement, at least early on, was that if it's not Shabbatinism, it's diet Shabbatinism. It's Shabbatinism light. It's Shabbatinism that has all of the same dangerous ingredients, like it leads to the problem we just had. It's just not there yet. And so they were terrified of this movement. And they were terrified of the movement both because they wanted to maintain the integrity of Judaism, but also because they were terrified of what would happen if the Shabbat thing popped off again, if there were another one. And again, I know it's easy to kick the Mitnagim as this sort of like intellectualist, fogies or whatever. They were trying to shepherd a movement in the aftermath of the disaster, spiritual, and the last thing they wanted was the ingredients of that disaster become popular again. Now, what's happening and what's incredibly important, and I think this is what makes obviously proof of the proof of the pudding and the tasting or whatever, The Hasidic movement was ultimately not Shabbat humanity, Shabbat to begin. And how do we know that? In a generation or two, it became very rigorously halakhically conservative. To this day, if you go to a Hasidic synagogue, they are halakhic as the day is long. Now they have weird halakhic stuff. They follow a different minhag than Litvak people. They follow a much more Sephardi style minhag, which is odd because they're in Central Europe. Going on with Moed, which is unusual, specifically Kabbalistic thing. Most of the Hasidim, I don't feel it should do it. They do some unusual things, but at the end of the day, it's a halakhically conservative. They come down the side of the old school Kabbalah, which was Jewish law. It's the unique gateway to God. And rigorous following of the law of the halakha is a fundamental aspect of Kabbalah. So for all of the excesses, for all of the court, for all of the statutes, for all the rabbis, for all of the usual stuff they may do, for all the cartwheels they might do during prayer, streaming things and whatever, today, the law is the law, so they don't break it. Both sides of this equation, both the Mitnagim and the Hasidim, they spent generations executing each other. They excommunicate each other like every week. It's just a dreadful situation. Also, I should want to point this out in the defense of Hasidim, again, because I identify more with the Mitnag world. I will say that Besh Taltov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, was one of the Talmudists that actively opposed the Frank. So, from the very beginning, they were opposed to things like Frankism. Besh was. Taltov, the founder of Hasidism, was opposed to it. So, again, he was pro-Talmud camp, taught Talmud, etc. So, I just want to, the founder of the Hasidic movement was one of the Talmudists that actively opposed the Frankism. From the very beginning, they were opposed to things like Frankism. Besh, the founder of Hasidism, was opposed to it. So again, he was pro-Talmud camp, taught Talmud, etc. So I just want to, again, we all have our biases. I want to name my bias. I'm much more pro the black world, and I also want to make sure that I'm not ever misrepresenting the richness, the genius, and the deep spiritual power of the Hasidic movement. Just make it very clear that while I'm saying that there is a link at some level with the Hasidic world and the Shabbat world, I think that link is homologous, not one of common ancestry, and not one in which the Hasidic world was encrypted. I do not believe that in my truth. So I want that very clear because I don't want to appear that I'm slandering Hasidic people because that don't want to ever appear to me. I've learned in Hasidic yeshiva. Trust me, I have a deep respect for this. Hasidism would go on to become one form of Orthodox Judaism. In fact, if you probably encountered Orthodox Judaism, you probably encountered it through Hasidism. I bet everyone here who's Jewish has encountered Chabad at some level. And if you haven't encountered Hasidism, now they're the most looking of the Hasidic world, and if you've ever learned Kabbalah, it's very likely you've learned it in a Hasidic environment. You've probably learned Hasidic interpretations of Kabbalah. That form of Kabbalah is very popular, filtered down all the way to Jewish practices. So Hasidism has proved decisive in Jewish history. Now, other high-level Kabbalah, more academic, more intellectualist Kabbalah, would continue to go on in the Litvak world all the way till now. My understanding is it's still going on. I don't know much about it, but it's still going on. Further, Lurianic Kabbalah, it would stick, especially Lurianic Kabbalah as taken up by Chaim Vital. Why? Why is there no further significant development in Kabbalah following Lurian? The answer is, I think everyone after Shabbatai Tzvi is so gun-shy of major innovation in Kabbalah that they de facto settled on Lurian. They more or less said, this is it. We're not going to change this. We're not going to muck around with it. We will continue to systematize it. We'll continue to adopt it. We'll continue to adapt it. We'll modernize it. We'll systematize it. We'll turn it round and round. But Lurianic Kabbalah, I think that there was no major Kabbalistic innovation systematic innovation after I think that there was such a shell shock after the Shabbat says. So Luria and Kabbalah won. And all Kabbalah basically that exists now is some species of Luria and Kabbalah. So he won. We are all living in the shadow of Luria. And again, I think that the reason why there's never been another new kind of Kabbalah after Luria, basically because it's a shell shock. But, as you might imagine, there's a dark cloud on the horizon. And depending on how you view it, it might be a dark cloud, or it might be the clouds finally parting. It could be a dark cloud because what you might see coming is rationalism. What you might see coming is logic. What you might see coming is modernity, which strips the world of all spirituality and subjects it to the law of mechanism and logic, mathematics and science. Robs the world of spirituality. That might be the dark cloud that you see coming. If you see something else, you might look at the same thing and see something completely different. You might see the clouds of darkness finally parted after 1,000 years of darkness, of mysticism, of random speculation about a world that no one has access to, a world of backwardness and superstition, a world where people believe all kinds of nonsense that they can't. And you might see the clouds parting, the sun shining through in the form of logic and math and science and modernity. And if you're on me, the Haskalah, the Enlightenment buddy, because what's about to happen is that the Enlightenment is tearing through the non-Jewish world, and it's making enormous strides. The Industrial Revolution is beginning, and human rights. Right, this is the time there, the French Revolution, American Revolution. There's huge impulse at this point in the non-Jewish world towards science, towards math, towards logic. World and the Jews who are beginning to look out and see and to not choose maybe honestly begin to engage in the Jewish version of that enlightenment process, the enlightenment of Newton, the enlightenment of Kant. The same year that Shabtai Tzvi hypothesized is the same year that Newton invented calculus, discovered the fundamental nature of light, and wrote his main book on physics. It shows you how the world is different. Shabbatai is apostasy in Turkey, and Newton is fundamentally unlocking the secrets of physics, logic, and math. And by the time we get to the 1700s, the Jewish Enlightenment is beginning to take effect. Haskalah will begin to take effect. And what we're going to see is that in the aftermath of the Haskalah, which we'll talk about next time, the arrival of Enlightenment values in Judaism, that we're going to see a huge shift in Kabbalah. The 19th and 20th centuries will represent both an incredible loss in the Kabbalistic world. I mean the loss of life, loss of course, but also the rebirth of Kabbalah. The fact that we're having this conversation right now means something has changed. We are modern Jews for whom most of us would be declared heretics by the very people we've been studying for the past 15 weeks. All of us would have been condemned, probably. Many of us would never been allowed to study Kabbalah if you're not Jewish according to their rules. If you're not Jewish at all. We are, at some level, the inheritors of what's about to change. And what we're going to see is the interesting travails of Kabbalah into the 19th, 21st centuries. We'll undergo some of the most horrifying feats, and it will rise from those ashes. And some of the most important Kabbalistic texts are now available within the last 5 years. Something like the Zohar and Christian edition are now available to us. So next time, folks, we're going to turn our attention to the 19th, 20th, and 21st century to talk about the sort of vicissitudes of Kabbalah in the aftermath of the last major Kabbalistic innovation, which is Hasidism. We'll talk about sort of the post-Hasidic world. What does the world in the aftermath of the Hasidic world and the Holocaust, the rise of the internet, with the rise of liberal Judaism? What does Kabbalah, how does Kabbalah adapt, reconfigure itself, and survive in all environments? The sound of talking about Kabbalah, you know that the story is it's a happy one. Kabbalah survives and thrives. We'll talk about that process. Thank you. respects. Welcome back.
You fired. Go focus.
Joining me as I explore the North